talking about what happened to Israel in its infancy. And God called Israel as his son. Exodus 4:22, Israel is my son, my firstborn. He called his son Israel out of Egypt. It has nothing to do with Jesus. And that's why Matthew only quoted the second part of the verse. That was a sigh. Okay, first thing, by quoting the second half of the verse, especially for Jewish readers, he was assuming they knew the whole verse. If you read rabbinic literature, the later writings of the rabbis, it is common, it is the norm to quote parts of verses with the assumption that you know the rest. It would be just as if I'm teaching and I said, for God so loved, okay, you know the rest of the verse. You can repeat it in your mind. And my point may be about the end of the verse, but I quote the beginning because you know that. What Matthew's saying, you read it two different ways. He's an idiot, he's a jerk, he's being deceptive, he's trying to trick people. He's willing to die. According to tradition, he dies for his faith, but he's stupid enough to think that he can put this here with the hope that nobody will ever look it up. The whole reason he's quoting prophecy is to get you to look it up. The whole reason he's quoting it is to get you to look back. That's the purpose of it. Okay, but the one view is he was an idiot. He had no idea how to handle the scriptures. He found this half of a verse, and now he turned it into a prophecy with the hope that nobody would ever bother. And he didn't know that one day there'd be Christian Bibles with cross-references, and you'd actually find in the margin, this is cited. He didn't know that was going to happen either, of course. So he was just hoping nobody would bother to look it up. Or you can say, Matthew quoted it with the assumption that people would know the whole verse. You say, but it's still not a prophecy. Hang on for a minute. Matthew is saying something very simple. As it happened to Israel, God's son in Israel's infancy, went down to Egypt in his infancy and came out of Egypt, so also it happened to the Messiah. One of our principles of interpretation, the Messiah is the ideal representative of his people. Come on, the imagery here with Herod going to kill the baby boys in Bethlehem, just as Pharaoh tries to kill all the baby boys in Egypt, because obviously in the spirit there's a sense that there's a deliverer coming and the enemy, Satan's trying to shut it down. The same thing here. Even when you get up, go down a few more verses. Verse 19, after Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life were dead. Same as God spoke to Moses. The people that were after his life were dead. Same parallels. It happened with Moses. It happens with the Messiah. As it happens to Israel in its infancy, God's son as a nation, going into Egypt and being called out, so also it happens to Jesus. And this is Matthew's whole point, the parallel. In fact, what happens after this is the immersion in the Jordan, okay? You have Israel passing through the Jordan. You have Jesus tempted in the wilderness for 40 days as Israel was tested in the wilderness for 40 years. And then where does he give his teaching when you get to Matthew 5? He goes up on a mountain and teaches, just as Israel receives the law at Mount Sinai. These are intentional things that Matthew's saying. Look at the parallels. As it happened with Israel, it happens with the Messiah, the ideal representative of his people. All you have to say is, if you as a rabbi believe that Yeshua was the Messiah, you'd have no problem with this. You'd say, oh yes, it happened with Israel, happened with the Messiah. But wait a second. This says, out of Egypt I called, out of Egypt I called my son. Whereas this is a verse about him going into Egypt. Well, I guess Matthew didn't realize that in was different than out. Or could it be that in order to be called out of Egypt, you first had to go into Egypt? And that's why Matthew's citing this. But well, let's keep reading here. Verse 16, when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. The voices heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Quoting from Jeremiah 31:15. Wait, he does it again. This is not a prophecy about the slaughter of the baby boys in Bethlehem. This is a prophecy about the Jewish people going into exile in Jeremiah's own day. And God says to the prophet, don't weep anymore because they're coming back. They're going to come back. So let me ask you a question. Was Rachel one of the early matriarchs in Israel's history? Was she actually weeping in Jeremiah's day? Or is this a poetic figure that Jeremiah uses as they march past what some would say is her burial ground, her descendants, her offspring in a secondary way? As they march by, the prophet hears her weeping over her children. It's a poetic figure. The exact same thing happens here. Matthew hears her weeping once again. People have written books about abortion called Rachel Weeping. They hear her weeping yet again. See, if you make Matthew into an idiot and do not understand the depth of his thinking, you think, oh, he's pulling this out, pulling this out. If you say, hey, wait, Messiah fulfills everything that's written in the Scripture. Everything written in the Scripture is ultimately pointing to God's work of redemption on the earth. And here, all of it, the voices are coming up again. The cries are being heard again. You read it like that, it makes perfect sense. But he's not saying, you should therefore believe Jesus is the Messiah because I'm quoting to you an irrefutable proof here. No, he just finds the melody and voices and sounds and force of the whole Scripture coming alive again and pointing to Messiah in many different ways. But we didn't get to the really bad one though yet, because Matthew actually makes up something. He makes it up. So they end up back in Nazareth. End of the chapter, end of Matthew 2. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets. He will be called a Nazarene. He will be called a Nazarene. Well, it's a quote because I got quotes in my English translation. Okay, first let's throw the quotes out because the quotes are not in the original. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets. He will be called a Nazarene. What prophet said that? Not written anywhere. No prophet said that. You won't find it anywhere. Matthew made it up. It's not only that he quoted verses out of context, it's not only that he stuck extra words in that didn't belong, it's not only that he twisted the meaning of other verses, he just made it up sometimes. I guess he hoped nobody would notice. He was trying to reach the Jews, but he just hoped nobody would notice. So let's take a serious look at this, because there is the question of, what does he mean? First, notice that the only time in his book he uses a different formula. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, plural. Got it? He doesn't quote the prophet. He doesn't quote Jeremiah. He doesn't quote Isaiah. Prophets, plural. That's the first thing. It doesn't occur anywhere else. Then he will be called a Nazarene. There are lots of different ideas as